Mike Tyson sat in the bright studio lights, his expression unreadable, his presence alone enough to shift the energy in the room. Across from him, the host smiled, confident, rehearsed, ready to control the conversation. He thought he had the upper hand. He thought he knew how this was going to play out. Tyson had been here before. Pushed, cornered, prodded for a reaction. They wanted the monster. They wanted the headlines. But Tyson wasn't giving them what they expected. The questions were loaded, the setup was clear. They weren't here to talk. They were here to make him prove something, to make him break. But Tyson had learned long ago that the most dangerous punch is the one you never see coming. And tonight the knockout wouldn't come from his fists. It would come from his silence, his control, his ability to dismantle the entire game without ever standing up from his chair. What happened next would leave the internet on fire and his opponent scrambling for words he couldn't find. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow we have another inspiring story just for you. The lights were too bright, not just bright, blinding, the kind that made sweat bead on your forehead even if you weren't nervous. But Mike Tyson wasn't nervous. He sat in the plush chair, his massive frame sinking into the sleek modern set design, shoulders relaxed, hands folded in his lap. The studio audience murmured, a mix of anticipation and curiosity hanging in the air. Some were here to see him fall apart. Others to witness another spectacle, one more viral clip for the internet to tear apart. He knew the game. He'd played it before. Across from him, the host sat poised, his smile just a little too perfect, his suit a little too tight, his body language screaming confidence, but his eyes flicking over his notes, recalculating. He was young, ambitious, the type who thought he could push a man like Tyson into a corner with just words. Mike had seen 1,000 guys like him, slick, fast-talking, always convinced they were the smartest person in the room. He wasn't impressed. "Mike, man, I gotta say, it's an honor," the host began, his voice smooth, practiced, that calculated mix of charm and subtle condescension. "You've had an incredible career, one of the greatest fighters of all time, but let's be honest, you've also had, let's call it, a complicated history." Mike just watched him, unmoving, unreadable. He could hear the audience shift, waiting for the tension to build. The host leaned forward slightly, as if closing the gap between them gave him an advantage. "People talk about redemption, about second chances, but a lot of folks out there still see you as a guy who couldn't control himself. The anger, the violence. I mean, you've punched reporters before, haven't you?" A ripple of laughter in the audience, not outright disrespectful, but mocking. Mike inhaled slowly, his expression unchanged. "I mean, people love a comeback story," the host continued, smirking now, sensing an opening. "But have you ever thought that maybe, just maybe, some things can't be redeemed? That maybe some men are just wired for destruction?" The words hung in the air. The host was playing his hand early, trying to rattle him, trying to get a reaction. Mike could feel the weight of 100 cameras zooming in, waiting for him to flinch, to crack, to give them the explosion they came for. Instead, he smiled, a slow, almost imperceptible curl of the lips, just enough for the host to notice. "I don't know, man," Mike said, his voice low, steady. "You ever been hit in the face before?" The host blinked, the smirk faltering for half a second. Mike leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "I'm just curious. Ever had someone hit you so hard you heard your ancestors? Ever felt your own teeth shake in your skull?" He let the question sit there. The audience had gone silent now. Even the camera crew had stopped fidgeting. The host recovered quickly, clearing his throat, forcing out a chuckle. "Well, I try to avoid that kind of thing," he said, flashing his practiced grin again. Mike nodded slowly. "Yeah, most people do." The host shifted, trying to steer back. "But see, that's exactly what I'm talking about, Mike. That edge, that threat. People still see you as dangerous." Mike let the words settle. Then he tilted his head slightly, almost amused. "Dangerous?" he repeated. He glanced at the audience, then back at the host. "That's funny. I always thought the most dangerous people were the ones who never threw a punch in their life." The energy in the room shifted. The host's grip on his cue cards tightened just a little. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The studio had the kind of manufactured energy that felt almost real if you didn't think too hard about it. The lights were positioned to make everything sharper, more dramatic, every angle calculated for maximum effect. The audience, a curated blend of eager onlookers and planted skeptics, murmured with anticipation, their faces glowing under the bluish hue of the overhead rigging. Cameras moved fluidly across the stage, adjusting to catch every reaction, every twitch, every bead of sweat that might betray the guest in the hot seat. Mike Tyson sat there, unmoved. His massive hands rested lightly on the arms of the chair, his fingers occasionally tapping against the smooth surface, slow and methodical, like a man listening to a distant rhythm no one else could hear. He wasn't a stranger to this setting, but he'd never belonged here either. This was their world, a place where words were weapons and silence was a weakness. He knew they expected him to react, to explode, to be the beast they thought they understood. They were waiting for the monster, the legend, the punchline. Across from him, the host played his role to perfection. Young, sharp-featured, dressed in a tailored suit that looked like it had never seen a crease, he radiated the kind of confidence that came from knowing the game was rigged in his favor. He sat with a casual ease, leaning just far enough forward to suggest engagement, but not so much that it looked like he was trying too hard. The smirk on his lips was carefully measured, a mix of amusement and challenge, as if he knew something the rest of the world didn't. The teleprompters scrolled behind the cameras, feeding him the lines that would shape the conversation, that would guide the narrative they had already prepared before Mike had even stepped onto the stage. The producers, hidden just beyond the lights, watched from their control room, their fingers hovering over switches, ready to cut, edit, manipulate. The studio audience was another character in the play. Some were genuine fans, here to see a legend in person. Others were here for the spectacle, to watch a controlled demolition unfold in real time. They had been conditioned to react on cue, to gasp, to laugh, to murmur at just the right moments. And then there were the plants, strategically placed individuals who would shift the energy of the room when needed, nodding at the host's words, shaking their heads at the guests, murmuring their disapproval in ways that the microphones would conveniently catch. Mike took it all in without moving. His breathing was slow, measured. His eyes scanned the room, not searching, just observing, the way a fighter sizes up his opponent before the first bell rings. He had faced men in the ring who wanted to tear him apart, who had trained their whole lives for one shot at knocking him down. But this was something different. This wasn't about fists or power. This was about perception, about control. He could see it in the way the host shifted slightly in his chair, already angling himself for dominance. "So, Mike," the host said, his voice smooth, effortless, sliding into the conversation like a knife through silk. "You're here, live, in front of millions of people watching at home. You've had one of the most storied careers in sports history, a true icon. But let's be real. People don't just want to talk about the past. They want to talk about you, about who you are now." Mike nodded slightly, waiting. The host let the silence stretch, just long enough to make it uncomfortable, just long enough to create the illusion that Mike was hesitating. Then he leaned in a fraction of an inch, just enough to suggest intimacy, as if he were offering Mike something other than a trap. "I have to ask," he continued, his voice carrying the faintest trace of amusement, as if they were sharing an inside joke only he understood. "Do you ever look in the mirror and wonder if you really left that old version of yourself behind?" There it was, the opening jab. The audience stilled, the tension thickening in the room. The cameras zoomed in slightly, just enough to catch the smallest flicker of a reaction. The host's fingers twitched against the desk, waiting for the first crack, for the first sign that the beast was still in there, caged but restless. Mike just blinked. The weight of his gaze made the host shift just slightly. "Do you?" Mike asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried. The host hesitated, caught off guard by the reversal. He let out a soft chuckle, tilting his head as if to brush it off. "I mean, we're not here to talk about me, Mike." "I know," Mike said, his expression unreadable. "But I asked anyway." A ripple moved through the audience. Some laughed, some murmured. The host's smirk tightened, but he recovered quickly. "Fair enough," he said, nodding. "But let's not pretend you don't know what I mean. You were one of the most feared men in the world, and now?" He gestured vaguely, a small wave of the hand meant to encapsulate everything Mike had become. "Now you do podcasts, you give motivational speeches. People love a redemption story, but come on. Do you ever feel like you're playing a role?" Mike exhaled slowly, a deep breath through his nose. "That's funny," he said, tilting his head just slightly. "You talk a lot about roles." The host blinked, his mouth half open, as if preparing another line, another hook to draw Mike in. But he didn't speak. Mike let the moment stretch, let the silence fill the space between them. Then, finally, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, his expression unreadable. "I guess we'll find out who's really acting," he said. The room was quiet now, the audience unsure whether to laugh, to gasp, to react at all. Even the host didn't know what to do with that. The cameras kept rolling, the show had only just begun. The host exhaled sharply, adjusting his posture, recalibrating. He had come prepared, but something in the room felt off now. Tyson wasn't playing the game the way he was supposed to. There was no defensiveness, no easy-to-exploit aggression, just stillness. An unsettling patience that made every second stretch longer than it should. The host cleared his throat, flipping through his notes as if he needed them, but they both knew he didn't. He had rehearsed this. "Mike, let's talk about reputation," he said, tapping his pen against the desk, keeping his voice light but pressing. "You've had quite the evolution, from the youngest heavyweight champion in history to a controversial figure to, well, let's just say a more refined version of yourself. But people still remember the incidents, the fights outside the ring, the headlines, the temper. Do you ever think about how that follows you? How people might always see you as that guy?" The audience reacted. Just a murmur, a shift in the air. The host had taken his first real shot. The words were phrased as curiosity, but the undertone was clear. "You haven't changed. You're still dangerous. You're still the problem." Tyson blinked, slow and deliberate. He let the question settle, let the moment breathe. The host held his practiced smirk, but something in his grip on the pen betrayed him. "You ever think about how people see you?" Tyson finally said, his voice even, controlled. The host chuckled, shaking his head as if dismissing the pivot. "Come on, Mike, this isn't about me." Tyson didn't blink. "But it could be." The audience murmured again, just a bit louder this time. The host kept the grin on his face, but it wasn't sitting as easily now. He shifted in his chair, glanced at the teleprompter, then back at Tyson. "Look, I get it. You want to flip it on me, make me the topic. But we're here to talk about you. That's what people want to know. They want to understand who you are now, whether the anger is still there." Tyson leaned forward slightly, his hands still resting lightly on the chair's arms. "You ever been in a fight?" The host hesitated, thrown by the sudden question. "I mean, I've been in disagreements, sure." "No," Tyson cut in, shaking his head. "A fight, a real one, a fight where you felt your life could end if you didn't win." Silence. The audience stilled, the host's practiced charm flickering just for a second. He licked his lips, searching for the right balance between control and humor. "I'm a talk show host, Mike. I try to avoid those kinds of situations." Tyson nodded as if he expected that answer. "That's the difference between you and me." The host exhaled sharply through his nose, regaining his rhythm. "Right, and that's exactly what I mean. That edge, that mindset. Some would say it's what made you great, others might say it's what made you unpredictable." There it was, the next step, the shift from reputation to control. Tyson tilted his head, watching him carefully. "Unpredictable?" The host leaned in slightly, sensing the shift in power and trying to seize it back. Yeah, you've said it yourself. You were an animal in the ring. You didn't just fight. You wanted to hurt people. And that mentality, that drive, it's not something that just disappears, is it? The audience tensed. This was the question they had been waiting for. This was the moment the producers were counting on. If Tyson bristled, if he even slightly raised his voice, the headline wrote itself. Mike Tyson snaps on live television. Tyson let the question linger, watching the host, watching the cameras, watching the way the audience sat perfectly still, waiting. Then, finally, he inhaled deeply and exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "You ever see a lion in a cage?" he asked. The host hesitated, confused by the sudden shift. "A lion?" Tyson nodded slowly. "Yeah." "You ever go to a zoo and see a lion behind the glass?" Just sitting there, people standing outside, watching, pointing, thinking because it's not moving, because it's not roaring, it's not dangerous anymore. The host swallowed. "I guess." Tyson didn't let him finish. See, that's the mistake people make. They think because the lion ain't attacking, it's not still a lion. The studio was dead silent. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed frozen, as if afraid to move. The host opened his mouth, but he had nothing. No quip, no joke, no smooth transition. He had pushed Tyson toward the edge, expecting him to explode. Instead, he had been met with something far more unsettling. Complete, calculated control. Tyson leaned back in his chair again, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "You want me to lose my temper? That's what you want, right?" The host forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "No, Mike, that's..." "Yeah, it is," Tyson interrupted, his voice quiet but absolute. "Because that's the story you came here to tell. The same story they've been telling about me for years. That I'm an animal. That I'm violent. That I don't belong in places like this. That I'm still that guy." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I used to get mad about that, used to take the bait. But now," he shrugged, "now I just watch." The host laughed, but it was thin, empty. "Come on, Mike, no one's trying to paint you as..." Tyson cut him off again, this time with nothing but a look, a sharp, piercing stare that made the host physically shift in his seat. "You can keep asking the same question," Tyson said, his voice softer now, almost amused, "but you're not going to like the answer." The host licked his lips, eyes flicking toward the producer's booth, waiting for some kind of direction. He had lost control of the room, and everyone knew it. Tyson just sat there, watching. The air in the studio was heavy now, the kind of weight that made people shift in their seats, clearing their throats just to break the silence. The host wasn't smiling anymore, not really. The corners of his mouth still curled upward, but the warmth was gone. He was recalculating, trying to find his way back into control. Tyson could see it in the way the man's fingers tightened around his pen, how his eyes flicked toward the producers, waiting for some unspoken cue. He wasn't used to this. He was the one who led the dance, the one who dictated the rhythm, and right now he was falling behind. Tyson had been here before, not in this exact setting, but close enough. He knew what came next. The host was about to double down. The host let out a breath, shaking his head with a forced chuckle. "All right, Mike, I hear you," he said, his voice still smooth, still controlled, but just a little tighter at the edges. "You think I'm trying to push a certain narrative, that I want to paint you a certain way. But let's be real. You've given people plenty of reasons to see you that way, haven't you?" He leaned forward slightly, tapping his pen against his notes. "I mean, we're not just talking about what happened in the ring, we're talking about the arrests, the headlines, the interviews where you've lost your temper. People don't just make this stuff up. It's all out there. So, my question is, how much of that is really the media twisting things, and how much of it is just who you are?" The audience reacted. Some murmuring, some nodding. It was a smart play. He wasn't outright attacking Tyson. He was shifting the burden onto him, forcing him to justify himself, framing it as if he was just asking the tough questions. But Tyson didn't move. He sat there, letting the words settle, his expression unreadable. Then he inhaled, slow and steady. "You ever hear the story about the scorpion and the frog?" Tyson asked, his voice even. The host blinked, caught off guard. Sure," he said, nodding. "It's a classic." Tyson tilted his head. "Yeah? Tell it to me." The host hesitated, shifting slightly in his chair, trying to figure out if this was another trap. "Well," he said, forcing a smile, "the scorpion asks the frog for a ride across the river. The frog doesn't trust him, says he's afraid the scorpion will sting him. The scorpion promises he won't, so the frog agrees. Halfway across, the scorpion stings the frog, and when the frog asks why, the scorpion says, 'Because it's in my nature.'" He smirked slightly, trying to regain his confidence. "That about right?" Tyson nodded slowly. "That's how people tell it." The host chuckled, sensing an opportunity. "Well, Mike, I gotta ask, are you saying you're the scorpion in this story? That no matter what you do, no matter how much you change, at the end of the day, it's just in your nature?" Tyson exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "See, that's the mistake people make," he said. "They only remember the ending. They forget the part where the scorpion convinces the frog to trust him first. They forget that the scorpion doesn't just sting him because he stings him when they're halfway across the river, when it's too late to turn back. That's what people do. They tell you they're giving you a chance. They say they see the change, but they're just waiting until you're too deep in the water to get out." The studio was silent. The host's smile twitched, barely holding. "Now," Tyson continued, shifting slightly in his chair, "you tell me, who's really the scorpion here?" A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. The host straightened his posture, his fingers flexing against the desk. He was losing them, and he knew it. He needed to pull the focus back. "All right, Mike," he said, exhaling as if letting something go. "I get it. You don't trust the media. You don't trust how people talk about you. But let's not pretend like you haven't contributed to that image yourself. There was an interview you did years ago, very famous, where you told a reporter you wanted to eat his children. People saw that and thought, this guy is unhinged. They weren't making it up. So tell me, was that just another case of the media twisting your words? Or was that real?" There it was. The shift from reputation to humiliation. He was reaching into the past, digging up the most infamous moments, throwing them back at him, hoping to get a reaction. Tyson could feel the weight of the audience's stares, the slow zoom of the cameras, the way the host leaned in like a predator sensing weakness. Tyson blinked once. Then, after a pause, he chuckled, low, quiet, but unmistakably amused. He tilted his head slightly, studying the host the way he used to study opponents before the first punch was thrown. "You ever been hungry?" Tyson asked. The host hesitated. "Excuse me?" "I asked if you've ever been hungry," Tyson repeated, his tone light, almost casual. "Not like I could use a snack hungry. I mean stomach-twisting, head-spinning, body-shaking hungry. The kind where you don't think straight, where you start seeing things, where you'll say or do anything just to feel full." The host swallowed, his throat bobbing. "Mike, You ever been so hungry," Tyson continued, ignoring him, "that it feels like your body is turning against you, like you're fighting yourself just to stay in control?" Silence. The host's fingers tapped once against the desk, his mouth slightly open, but no words came out. "That's what that was," Tyson said, his voice quieter now, more measured. "It wasn't about that reporter. It wasn't about violence. It was about a man who had spent his whole life fighting to survive, sitting in a room where people wanted him to perform, to play a role. And in that moment, I was just hungry. Hungry for respect. Hungry for control. Hungry for something that nobody in that room was willing to give me." The host shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. The audience was locked in now, every breath held, every movement frozen. Tyson leaned forward just slightly, his voice softer. "Now, you tell me," he said. "What kind of man sees another man starving and decides to put a camera in his face?" The host let out a quiet breath, barely audible. His shoulders tensed, his fingers flexed against the desk, and for the first time all night, he had nothing to say. Tyson leaned back again, exhaling through his nose. That's what I thought. The studio was silent. Even the producers weren't calling for a break. The show had taken on a life of its own now, something raw, something no one had expected. The host's smile was gone. His hands were clenched together, his body language screaming discomfort. And Tyson? Tyson was just watching. The silence in the studio was thick now, the kind that made every small movement feel louder than it was. The host sat there, blinking too much, shifting slightly in his chair as if trying to shake off whatever had just happened. He had come into this expecting control, expecting Tyson to be the one who cracked under the weight of the moment. Instead, the weight had shifted onto him, and it was pressing down hard. He licked his lips, exhaled, and forced a small laugh, the kind that sounded more like a reflex than an actual reaction. "All right, Mike," he said, his voice just a little tighter now. "You've made your point. But let's be real. If you really think the media is the problem, why do you keep coming back? Why sit here in a studio on live television if you don't trust the people asking the questions?" Tyson exhaled slowly, watching him. The host had reached the last card in his deck, the desperate attempt to flip the script before the moment slipped entirely out of his hands. He wanted Tyson to justify himself, to explain why he was even here if he believed the game was rigged. But Tyson wasn't playing along. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady, as if considering the question. Then he leaned forward just a little, elbows resting on the chair's armrests, his voice lower now, quiet. "You ever been in the ring with a guy who thinks he already won?" Tyson asked. The host hesitated. "I'm not sure I follow." Tyson nodded slightly, as if he expected that answer. "I've fought guys like that. Guys who walk into the ring thinking they've already won. Thinking the crowd's on their side. Thinking their training, their people, their whole setup is enough to guarantee them the win. They don't see the fight. They see the victory speech." The host forced a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And what happens to those guys?" Tyson's fingers tapped lightly against the chair's armrest. "They don't hear the punch that knocks them out." The studio was still. The audience, the producers, even the camera crew, no one moved. The host let out another small laugh, but this time it was different. Hollow. He knew what had just happened. He had walked right into it. Tyson leaned back again, exhaling through his nose. "That's why I come back. Not for you, not for the cameras, not for whatever story you came in here thinking you were going to tell. I come back to remind people that no matter how much they think they've won, the fight's not over until the last punch lands." The host opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was looking at the teleprompter now, at the producers, anywhere but at Tyson. For the first time all night, he wasn't leading the conversation. He was drowning in it. The cameras kept rolling, but something had changed. This wasn't an interview anymore. This wasn't a talk show moment designed to be clipped into a soundbite. This was something real, something raw, something that wasn't supposed to happen. Tyson watched him, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long beat, he shook his head slightly as if disappointed. "You came here thinking you were going to control this," he said. "That you were going to push the right buttons, poke at the right wounds, get the reaction you wanted. But that's not how this works." He gestured toward the audience. "You got all these people watching, waiting. They're not waiting for an answer. They're waiting for a..." The host swallowed, shifting again, his fingers gripping the stack of cue cards in front of him. His breathing was just a little heavier now, his jaw tight. He started, but Tyson cut him off before he could get another word out. "You wanted me to be the old me," he said. "That's what this whole thing was about. You wanted me to yell, to snap, to prove you right. But see, that's the thing about fighters. The good ones, the ones who last, they don't fight every battle the way people expect them to." The audience was completely silent now. The host looked smaller somehow, like he had shrunk into his chair, the confidence he walked in with replaced by something else. Uncertainty. Tyson had flipped the power dynamic without ever raising his voice, without ever getting angry, without ever giving them the explosion they were hoping for, and now there was only one thing left to do. Tyson sat forward again, his voice calm but sharp. You ever seen a man lose a fight before he even knew it started? The host didn't answer. He didn't have to. The moment had already landed. The weight of the moment sat heavy in the room. The host wasn't smiling anymore, not even pretending. His hands were still gripping the cue cards, but it was clear he wasn't reading them anymore. His breathing was slower, measured, like someone trying to regain control of something that had already slipped too far away. Tyson just watched him, calm, still, patient. He had seen this look before. Not in the studio, but in the ring. The moment when a fighter realizes he's losing, that the plan he walked in with isn't working, that the opponent standing across from him isn't the version he trained for. The audience wasn't laughing, wasn't murmuring, wasn't even shifting in their seats. They were locked in, hanging on to the silence as much as the words that had come before it. Even the cameras seemed frozen, the operators hesitating before zooming in, as if afraid to miss whatever came next. The host let out a slow breath, then forced a chuckle, though it came out awkward, unnatural. "Well, Mike," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of the performative confidence he had walked in with. "I think it's safe to say this interview didn't go the way I expected." Tyson tilted his head slightly, amused but not gloating. "That's the problem with expectations," he said. "They only work when you control the outcome." The host nodded, as if accepting something, then set the cue cards down, flattening his hands against the desk. "You know," he started, his voice carrying something different now, not quite surrender, but not far from it. "I think a lot of people wanted to see this go a certain way. They wanted to see you react. They wanted to see the guy from all those old clips. But you didn't give them that." Tyson exhaled through his nose, then leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "People don't want the truth," he said. "They want a story. They want something that fits what they already believe. If they see you as a monster, they want proof. If they see you as a hero, they want proof of that too. But the truth? That's not as fun." The host nodded again, slower this time, like he was processing the weight of the words. "And what is the truth?" Tyson studied him for a moment, then let a small smirk pull at the corner of his lips. "The truth is," he said, "I don't owe you that answer." The reaction was instant. The audience exhaled all at once, a mix of nervous laughter and tension breaking all at once. Some clapped, some just sat there, taking in what had just happened. The host blinked, his mouth half open like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Tyson sat back again, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "You want me to explain myself? But I don't need to. I know who I am. I know what I've done, what I've learned, what I've changed. But you? You came here with a version of me already in your head. You weren't looking for answers. You were looking for confirmation." The host cleared his throat, adjusting his tie, forcing a nod. "Fair enough," he said, his voice quieter now. "I guess that's something we're all guilty of." Tyson shrugged. "Maybe, but not all of us get paid to do it on TV." The audience erupted, the tension finally snapping. Some laughed, some clapped, and the host, his face locked in a tight smile, just sat there, nodding, accepting the fact that there was no way to spin this back in his favor. Tyson hadn't just won the moment, he had dismantled the whole game, flipped the interview from a controlled spectacle into something the network never intended. The producers in the control room were scrambling, their voices in the host's earpiece telling him to wrap it up, to pivot, to move on, but it was too late. He knew it. Everyone knew it. He let out a short breath, forced his best version of a smile, and reached for the closing lines he had prepared. "Well, Mike, I appreciate you coming on the show. This was definitely a conversation to remember." Tyson just nodded. "Yeah, it was." The cameras stayed on him for a second longer than usual, as if the director was waiting for something more, one last soundbite, one last moment to package up and sell. But Tyson didn't give them anything else. He just sat there, composed, unmoving. The final shot before the show cut to commercial was of the host looking down at his desk, exhaling sharply, while Tyson simply watched. The fight was over, and everyone knew who had won. The interview ended, but the real fight had only just begun. Before the cameras even stopped rolling, before the host could retreat backstage to process what had just happened, the internet had already decided the outcome. Within minutes, clips from the broadcast flooded Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, every platform that could turn a single moment into a cultural event. Someone in the live audience had uploaded an uncut segment before the network could sanitize it, and that was all it took. Mike Tyson just dismantled an entire talk show without raising his voice. This wasn't an interview, this was a masterclass in composure. The host tried to play chess, but Tyson was playing something else entirely. The hashtags came fast. Tyson unfiltered, Mike didn't flinch, he didn't hear the punch, each one carrying thousands, then tens of thousands of posts dissecting every moment. Reaction videos popped up in real time, commentators breaking down the exchange frame by frame, highlighting the host's shifting body language, the way he fidgeted when he realized he had lost control, the exact second when he stopped being the interviewer and became the one being interviewed. Meme culture moved even faster. A still frame of Tyson leaning back, watching the host scramble for words, was instantly turned into reaction images. Captions ranged from "when you realize the final boss is real" to "that moment you know you messed up." Another edit showed the host in black and white, superimposed with the words, "You didn't hear the punch that knocked you out." A direct callback to Tyson's line that had already become legendary. The network scrambled. Within an hour, their social media team clipped the interview, cutting out the most devastating moments, trying to reframe it as a spirited debate rather than the public dismantling it had become. But the full version had already spread too far. Independent channels were reposting it faster than the network could take it down. The damage was done. On Twitter, blue-check journalists tried to spin it. Some called it a dangerous celebration of toxic masculinity. Others claimed Tyson used intimidation tactics to dominate the conversation, but none of it stuck. The replies were brutal. He never raised his voice. Intimidation? You mean keeping his cool while your guy panicked? The host set the trap and then fell into it. Meanwhile, Tyson? He didn't post a single thing. No response, no retweet, no comment. He didn't need to. The internet was doing all the work for him. The next morning, the fallout hit mainstream media. Morning talk shows cautiously acknowledged the viral storm, some praising Tyson's composure, others uncomfortably shifting the focus to the dangers of celebrating confrontation. But it was clear the network was in damage control mode. Behind the scenes, executives were furious. They had planned for a controversy, but they hadn't planned on losing. The host, once so confident, now looked exhausted in his follow-up statement posted late that night. "Healthy debate is important. I respect Mike's perspective, even if I don't agree with everything he said." It was a weak attempt at regaining ground, but the internet wasn't buying it. The replies were merciless. "Brother, you didn't debate. You just got sat down. Respect? You spent the whole interview trying to poke a bear and got surprised when it didn't dance." Sponsors took notice. A few quietly distanced themselves from the show, pulling planned ads from the next episode. The network's PR team scrambled, discussing whether to issue a bigger statement or let the storm pass. But there was no escaping it. The moment had already cemented itself in internet history. By the next evening, sports analysts, political commentators, and even celebrities had chimed in. Some called it a cultural reset, others a perfect example of what happens when you underestimate experience. Tyson's old opponents, fellow fighters, even retired sports legends, everyone had something to say. One boxing legend summed it up best. "Tyson just reminded the world that a true fighter doesn't need to throw a punch to win a fight."